It puts over 100,000 children domestically at risk every year. It affects over 1 million children worldwide, and it exploits them in ways that no human being, let alone a child, should ever have to experience.
Good afternoon, my name is Shahrnaz, and this is our team, Josh, Ilya, Ishan, and Jessica. Our project today was compiled on behalf of the Advisory Council on Child Trafficking in order to assist their efforts to end domestic child sex trafficking. ACCT is a bipartisan nonprofit advocacy group that is focused on finding and promoting solutions that are both cost-effective and backed by evidence. This group is based in Washington, D.C., and its members include women from a variety of backgrounds and political affiliations. This quarter, our project was to analyze key state and federal legislation in order to determine their contents and also in comparison to the best practices that were recommended by experts at ACCT's symposium in May 2013 that was hosted at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is organized criminal activity in which human beings are treated as possessions to be controlled and exploited. This mostly comes in two forms, the first being forced prostitution and the second being forced labor. So what is child sex trafficking? Child sex trafficking includes any minor under the age of 18 involved in the commercial sex trade. This means that consent is completely irrelevant. Our subset of trafficking that ACCT is concerned with, and thus we are concerned with, falls under three categories. The first is domestic trafficking. We're not really concerning ourselves with international trafficking. Second is child trafficking, minors under the age of 18, and also sex trafficking. This means we're not really concerning ourselves with labor trafficking.
To give you a preview on how the rest of the presentation will go, first we're going to walk through the key research takeaways from the symposium working groups. Second, we're going to review the key pieces of federal and state legislation that deal with anti-trafficking. Third, we're going to walk you through the grid that you have in front of you right now. We use this grid to visually diagram all these key pieces of legislation and which key areas of the research they touch on. Finally, we're going to offer, in a summation of our findings, a series of recommendations that look at the key research takeaways and see which pieces of legislation incorporate them, which ones don't, and why that matters.
As Ilya mentioned, we'll start out by going over best practices from researchers at the symposium. And the areas we'll be looking at are law enforcement, first responders, technology, treatment, domestic research, and international research. So to start out with law enforcement, there are a few areas identified by researchers. The first is training, so specifically forensic victim interviewing, cultural competency, and trafficker tactics. There's also a need for a victim-centered approach, not treating children as prostitutes or criminals, rather treating them as victims. And then finally, there's a need for interstate collaboration because a lot of trafficking happens across state lines, as well as collaboration between public and private entities.
And for the first responders group at the symposium, one of the key points brought up was the lack of awareness about domestic child sex trafficking, particularly among law enforcement, professionals serving youth, and at-risk children. A second point brought up was the lack of research on the intersection between internet and communication technology, abbreviated here as ICT, with trafficking operations. Currently, traffickers are using ICT to communicate with each other, interact with a broader audience, and interact with victims. A third point brought up was the lack of coordination and standardization for services provided to victims as well as support and treatment. And the fourth point brought up was the juvenile justice system. Currently, victims can be sent to the criminal justice system, but they often do not receive the necessary treatment, support, or services. And for technology, one of the symposium experts brought up the point that there needs to be an understanding of the criminal justice system's acceptance and use of electronic evidence, as well as their understanding of recent technologies. Another point brought up was the use of ICT by traffickers and victims in order to help law enforcement track and intercept communication. And the last point was electronic collaboration between law enforcement and NGOs so that they can facilitate sharing data without violating security protocols or privacy laws.
So under treatment at the Johns Hopkins Symposium, we looked at research from academics, social workers, and from previous victims themselves. First, there needs to be more evidence-based approach. We don't know what types of treatments work, how long they take to work, or why they work. Second, we need help, according to the academics and social workers, in identifying at-risk youth and also victims who have already experienced these horrible crimes. Third and fourth, we need additional infrastructure, both in terms of more research, more social workers, and more centers of care, and we need more cooperation between agencies, private, public, national, and state.
Next, for domestic research, the experts at the symposium, we took basically 4 main points away from our research. The first is we need more research in general on traffickers themselves, how they go about their business, how they get into the sex trade. Next, we need more research on best practices for collaboration, and what I mean by that is best practice for collaboration among NGOs, child welfare agencies, as well as the other areas we've been talking about, law enforcement and first responders. Next, we need more research into how best to identify victims, and we also need more research on how best to collect data on how many victims there are in the United States. Lastly, we need more research into the effectiveness of public programs that we're implementing. It doesn't do much good to implement these public programs if we don't know what the effect or the impact is on this problem. Along with the effectiveness of public programs, domestic research is also asking for additional funding.
So there have been a range of efforts internationally to research and target this problem, and we see a few key takeaways in terms of best practices and areas where we need further research. When it comes to best practices, one key thing identified is the need for more coordination within different groups in criminal justice, with health professionals, with social workers, and between states and countries in combating the problem and sharing information. We also see the need for more involvement of social workers in terms of involving them earlier on in the process once victims are identified, and later on to make sure that they are fully reintegrating and feeling comfortable living in society once again. And finally, there is a need here for better quality treatment. This is physical care. This is also trauma care for people mentally rehabilitating from the horrific experience that they had. We also see a few areas where more research is needed. One is about global prevalence. How many kids are trafficked every single year in the United States? How many kids are trafficked every single year internationally? And the way that we reach this conclusion is by having more consistency across states in their definition of what exactly child sex trafficking is. We also see a need to investigate the role of local factors in how communities will be receptive to an attempt to intervene and combat trafficking, and also how they affect the motivations of traffickers and of the people that end up being trafficked in the system.
In the first section, we gave you an overview of research takeaways from the symposium. Now we're going to give you an overview of the legislation we looked at. So we looked at 5 federal bills currently on the table, as well as some state bills that take innovative approaches towards dealing with child sex trafficking. And we broke up these bills into 5 main approaches. The first approach deals with better identification of victims, and we see this in 2 federal bills, the Bass Bill and the Wine Bill. And not just identification of victims, but identification of youth who are at risk for getting into trafficking. And then these numbers are important to know because that informs the government of where to allocate resources. The second approach we looked at deals specifically with the foster care system. We see this in another federal bill, the Hatch Bill. And this is important because traffickers are known to target children within the foster care system, not to mention that 30,000 youth are emancipated from the foster care system each year, and they are particularly vulnerable. So the Hatch Bill promotes age-appropriate activities for teens to give them a positive outlet and keep them away from trafficking. In addition, the Hatch Bill promotes housing for youth at risk. The third approach that we looked at, we see in the Cornyn Bill, a federal bill that came out only a couple weeks ago, and this deals with better training and collaboration. So training of anti-trafficking task forces, as well as block grants to facilitate public-private collaboration.
The fourth approach we discussed is called prosecution and compensation. Basically, this approach, taken by both state and the Cornyn Bill, as Josh was talking about, calls for stricter prosecution of traffickers and using those increased funds to help both emotionally and financially victims of child sex trafficking. So the first kind of key takeaway is a New York bill called for further imprisonment of traffickers up to 15 years to make the business riskier. It also called, the California Prop 35 bill called for increased fines. So if you're caught trafficking, you can pay up to $1.5 million. The New York bill equated child sex trafficking with rape by upgrading it to a Class B felony, which signaled to traffickers. And finally, the Cornyn bill, like Josh was discussing, established the Domestic Trafficking Victims Fund, which allocated up to $2 million for child pornography and other specific victims of different types of child sex trafficking. So it's a unique kind of approach.
The fifth and final approach, which is mostly focused on by the bills from Florida, focuses on rehabilitation, and they do so in two ways. The first is establishing a mechanism for victims to appeal to the court system and remove crimes from their public record that they were coerced into as a consequence and in the duration of them being trafficked. And key here is the acknowledgement that the actions that victims are forced into in the process of their exploitation can, in the long term, affect their ability to reintegrate, not just emotionally, but also vocationally. And second, there is a broad focus on reintegration, making sure that victims receive high-quality care, making sure that the people that work with them have the kind of treatment and training that they need to understand what are their emotional states of mind, what things do they need in terms of communication, etc., to make sure that they properly reintegrate into society.
In the first section, we gave you an overview of best practices from research. Then we walked you through the legislation broken up into 5 approaches. Now we want to synthesize the first 2 sections by looking at how well do bills incorporate best practices from research.
And we did that with a grid. So you have a handout of our grid in front of you. This is the grid in its entirety, but it's a bit much to explain to you. So we created a simplified version so I can help explain. We have our rows coming across. We have our 6 research areas from the symposium. And then we have our columns from federal legislation all the way to state legislation. Within the cells, we gave these bills scores, a 0, a 0.5, or a 1. A 0 means that that particular criterion was not met by that bill. A 0.5, that meant it was partially covered, and we included an explanation of why it was only partial in the grid. And a 1 meant that that particular criterion was met in that particular bill. At the end of the row, we have summations, and we also color-coded our summations so that a green means that a majority of criterion were met across the board. And we also have vertical summations at the bottom as well. Within the grid, we also have red cells. Within the grid, we also have red cells where if there's only a best practice that was only included in one particular bill across the entire grid, that's highlighted in red as well.
Now that Jessica has given you a framework for analysis, we now want to break it down by research areas and look at how well bills incorporate best practices. So to start out with law enforcement, there are several federal bills that deal with better training for law enforcement officials. There are both federal and state bills that get tougher on criminals. And finally, there are 2 federal bills that promote data sharing.
For first responders, all of the federal bills mention some form of awareness and training, but they mainly focus on professionals serving youth. None of the bills mention research on ICT, although California's Prop 35 partially addressed the ICT used by traffickers. For victim services, all of the federal bills mention some form of long-term victim services except for the PO bill, and the Cornyn bill went the extra step of also including short-term victim services. For criminal justice reforms, only the Cornyn bill thoroughly addressed this, although the Florida bills partially addressed it by allowing victims to expunge their public records of convictions later down the road.
For technology, it was probably the research area that was least addressed across the board. For the first point, training the criminal justice system in ICT usage by both traffickers and trafficking victims, no bill addressed this. Secondly, as far as sharing databases, this was partially addressed by the Bass and Cornyn bill because there's data sharing between government agencies, but not necessarily between government agencies and private NGOs. Thirdly, as far as updating the laws about ICT usage, again, no bill actually addressed this. However, the Hatch bill partially addresses this by calling for foster care children to have access to personal cell phones and personal computers. We don't really know what the effect that will be, though.
So treatment, as contrasted to technology, is probably one of the best covered areas, but the method in which we're going about in legislation is not well understood. Testing treatment effectiveness has been attempted by both state and national legislation, but that methodology is sometimes not even statistically significant. Second, first responder training, tying into what Shahrnaz was talking about, has been covered by most of the bills. Third, additional infrastructure, again, has been covered by most of the bills, but one to highlight is the Cornyn bill that takes into account not only providing additional infrastructure, but specific tasks for the money that's given to different organizations. And last, collaboration, one area that needs to be further addressed and that has started to be addressed in the Cornyn bill.
Next we have domestic research, and there is good news on two fronts. As far as identifying victims and identifying better practices for collaborations, again, across NGOs, child welfare agencies, the whole lot, there is good progress in the Bass-Wyden, Hatch, and Cornyn bill. Basically all of the federal bills minus the Poe bill. As far as researching traffickers themselves, this was not covered at all in any piece of legislation. However, in the Hatch and Cornyn bill, as well as some of the state bills, there is harsher punishment for traffickers. As far as effectiveness of public programs go, this was not included at all. And as far as funding goes, both the Hatch and Cornyn bill include funding, but it's unclear where that goes as far as research.
As far as the takeaways from international research, and again, this is fortunate, a lot of the existing federal laws in particular hit on many of the key takeaways from the research group. We see that the Bass, Cornyn, and Wyden bills all in some way integrate greater coordination and sharing of information, at the very least among different bodies within the state criminal justice system. One thing that was entirely missing from all of the domestic bills was the earlier involvement of social workers, for example, when victims are first identified by law enforcement and liberated, to ensure that they have someone immediately that they can talk to, that they can receive emotional help with, etc. And that can be very important to making sure that they feel like they can start reintegrating and can start interacting better with law enforcement. We also see a focus across almost all the bills for high quality treatment and aftercare, and finally, a focus on comprehensive training. Not just for law enforcement, different groups in criminal justice, but also for social workers and everyone involved so that they know how to best interact with victims.
The last area of our analysis is prevention, and we see that there were a few federal bills that dealt with better identification of not only victims, but also youth at risk. And then the Hatch bill, the bill that focused particularly on the foster care system, promotes age-appropriate activities, as well as housing for youth at risk.
So to sum up, what do we know? We know that there has been progress in terms of anti-trafficking domestically and internationally. And we, after doing all of our research, looking at the things in these working groups, applaud the efforts of all domestic legislators made to combat trafficking and increase our understanding of the problem. At the same time, we acknowledge that there is still much work to be done, and there is still much more research that needs to be done into this problem so that we fully understand it. We see key practices that, if implemented, can go a long way in helping us along this path. Things like coordination, better training, better treatment, increased punishments to deter traffickers, better identification of victims, testing of all of these possible options to see which ones are the best at alleviating the problem, and finally, and arguably most importantly, research into identifying why people enter the trafficking system in the first place, what things allow it to exist in society, and how we can target them to reduce this phenomenon and exploitation moving forward. Thanks so much for your attention and your time, and we'll be happy to take any questions or comments you have.